Now let us turn our attention to the last pair of Vedic Darshanas, that is the Pūrva-Mīmāṃsā and the Vedanta. Before going into the details of Mīmāṃsā, let us see how these two are related or how these two differ from each other. The Pūrva-Mīmāṃsā, or what we are going to cover in this part, or Dharma-Mīmāṃsā, it establishes its tenet based on the Karma Kanda of the Vedas. So, the Karma Kanda is present in the earlier section of the Veda, the Brahmana especially, and to some extent the Samhita. So, they take these two sections of the Veda are the focus areas of the Pūrva-Mīmāṃsakas. On the other hand, Vedanta or Uttara-Mīmāṃsā establishes its tenets based on the Jnana Kanda or the Upanishadic section of the Veda. Apart from this, the Pūrva-Mīmāṃsā places a greater emphasis on the Brahmanas, which I was just saying is the earlier section, which deals more with the ritual aspect of the Veda, and it draws from it substantially. On the other hand, the Vedanta draws from the Upanishads and focuses more on them. The Pūrva-Mīmāṃsā believes that liberation or moksha is obtained by properly engaging in all these rituals and purifying our karma and finally extinguishing our karma. On the other hand, the Vedanta believes that the moksha or liberation can be attained only by total detachment from the worldly activities. That is the only way out of this cycle of karma. A very important distinction between these two is that the Pūrva-Mīmāṃsā does not accept the idea of God. If you remember, I had told you that the distinction between Astika and Nastika, or Vedic and non-Vedic, is not based upon their belief in Ishvara. So, this is one such school which falls under the Vedic Darshanas, but still does not accept the concept called Ishvara. So, the Pūrva-Mīmāṃsā think that they do not need this entity called Ishvara in order to explain their philosophical tenets. On the other hand, Vedanta to a great extent accepts this entity called Ishvara. This differences notwithstanding, they have certain common beliefs. Both the Mīmāṃsās share some common beliefs. They both accept that there is some entity called Atman. They both believe that there is something called karma and the Atman gets rebirth in various physical forms because of this karma. They believe that there is an never ending cycle of birth and death, and the goal of everyone's life should be to get away from this or break this cycle of birth and death and get ultimate moksha. So, these were the differences and the common features of these two Mīmāṃsās, the Pūrva-Mīmāṃsā and the Uttara-Mīmāṃsā. Now, let us try and gather a few more details about this. The first of these called Pūrva-Mīmāṃsā. Now, the term Mīmāṃsā itself means reflection or critical investigation, and here we want to find out or critically investigate the meaning of the Vedic utterances. Incidentally, the Pūrva-Mīmāṃsā has a very peculiar thesis. They believe that these Vedic utterances are unauthored, they are eternal. If you remember, the Nyaya and the Vaisheshika, they believed that the Vedic utterances were the utterances of Ishvara, they were authored by Ishvara, whereas the Pūrva-Mīmāṃsā believes that no, there is no such entity called Ishvara which has uttered these Vedas. In fact, if there is an Ishvara or not, we do not know, but it has nothing to do with the utterances of these Veda. So, these utterances are unauthored and eternal. So, in order to interpret or understand these Vedic utterances is the goal of Pūrva-Mīmāṃsā. So, these rules of interpreting these Vedic utterances have been systematized by Jaimini Rishi, who is said to be a student of Veda Vyasa, and in the Jaimini Sutras or the Mīmāṃsā Sutras, which are a collection of about 2500 sutras, but Jaimini Rishi has tried to give the various rules of interpretation of these Vedic utterances. These sutras are divided into various chapters, which are further divided into a certain number of sections, etc. And many commentaries have been written on this sutra. It is a common feature of all darshanas. The sutra literature is always followed by some sort of a bhashya, which is a commentary on those particular sutras. The most important commentary is Shabara Bhashya, which is available to us today in quite detailed commentary on the Mīmāṃsā Sutras. This was further commented upon by their students, most notably Kumarila Bhatta, one person, and the other one was Prabhakara. So, based on this, we have two major schools of Mīmāṃsā, the Bhatta school of Mīmāṃsā and the Prabhakara school of Mīmāṃsā. And in this 2500 sutras, Jaimini Rishi has given the various rules of interpreting Vedic utterances as well as the philosophical justification for observing these Vedic rituals. Many of us are always asking our parents why I should do this ritual, why I should do that ritual, etc. This does not seem to be a recent phenomena. All the way back then also people seem to have asked why we should do this. Jaimini has given some philosophical justification as to why we should continue doing these Vedic rituals. And in order to get liberation, they lay importance on performance of these Vedic rituals, and that is the karma, in order to accumulate punya and punya, so that we can finally get liberated. A pictorial representation of how Mīmāṃsā project can be set out is something like this. So, what happens is that the self is locked in a cycle of birth and death. So, in order to break this, how do we do this? It has to engage in action. What sort of action? The action which is allowed by the Veda, or it is told by the Veda, engage in this kind of action. Action here does not mean any kind of action, the action which is permitted or recommended by the Veda. But so if we do that kind of action via the correct interpretation of the Vedic text, we will be doing something called as dharmic. Our actions will be dharmic, and the result of this dharmic action will be the accumulation of punya, which will finally give us swarga, and eventually we will get liberation. On the other hand, if we do not interpret the Vedic texts properly, even if we indulge in karma, it will be adharmic, or it will not be conforming to the dharma, and therefore we will continue to acquire papa, which will again sink us into the same cycle of birth and death. So, in order to break this cycle, it is important to do karma, and to do dharmic karma, we have to interpret the Vedic text properly, which is why we have to use the Mīmāṃsā rules and follow it in the same spirit that the Mīmāṃsā lays out for us. Now, some of you may have the question that why we should study this Mīmāṃsā. Nobody reads the Vedas these days. There may be some few 10-15 people somewhere, they may be reading the Veda. What is the use for us over here? The important thing is Pūrva-Mīmāṃsā is concerned with interpretation of Vedic utterances. So, what it does is that it gives a theory of interpretation, or it is concerned with the philosophy of language, and it is concerned with interpreting utterances in it restricts itself to Veda, but you can take those general principles and develop a general theory of interpretation, or the science of hermeneutics can be developed based upon the principles of Pūrva-Mīmāṃsā. You can use these principles and apply them in other areas, for example, in legal treatises. That is one important area where the laws of, or the interpretational rules of Mīmāṃsā can be applied. So, you may have heard this argument, some lawyer argues that so and so is my right under article so and so of the constitution. Another lawyer will argue back saying that no, that article has to be read in conjunction with another article, therefore you do not have the right to do this. Now, how did this person know that that article has to be read in conjunction with another article? This is some rule of interpretation. So, each of us has different judges may have different interpretation of a particular complexly written, complexly worded article or law within our constitution. All of this can be handled by applying the Mīmāṃsā rules of interpretation. So, I have to read this article in conjunction with that. This article must be read only after another article, or one article supersedes another article, etc. These kinds of rules, these precedence rules, etc., interpretative rules, contextual rules, this is the sign, this something else is connected to this somewhere else in the constitution, etc. These sort of things, the Mīmāṃsā will be able, the Mīmāṃsā rules of interpretation will be able to help us in interpreting these things. So, this is the current relevance of Mīmāṃsā. So, it is not just one part of it is the interpretation of the Vedic utterances, etc. But from there we can also use it in other discourse and to do discourse analysis in some other areas.